On one side of the English Channel, thousands of men were actively hunted and thrown into hard labor for their sexuality. On the other side, inside a squalid Parisian hotel room, a man caught engaging in underground rough trade with a male prostitute did not face a prison cell. Instead, his silence was purchased with briefcases of untraceable cash, ensuring he remained a decorated hero of the British crown. He was Prince Henry, the Duke of Gloucester. How did the highest echelons of power subvert their own laws to protect a criminal prince? And what was the devastating psychological price extracted from the man trapped inside this perfect royal cover-up? In 1920s Britain, the state weaponized the legacy of the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act. Under the Labouchere Amendment, gross indecency between men remained a severe criminal offense, aggressively hunted and rigorously prosecuted. This was the exact legislation that had famously sent Oscar Wilde to ruin decades earlier. The police regularly utilized informants and conducted raids on underground clubs and public spaces. The courts handed down devastating prison sentences that stripped men of their careers, their families, and their fundamental standing in society. For a working-class man, a conviction meant total destitution. For a member of the aristocracy, it meant exile and permanent disgrace. For the House of Windsor, image was an absolute matter of survival. King George V, Henry's father, was a rigid, deeply conservative monarch who understood the precarious position of royalty in the modern age. Following the cataclysm of World War I, which saw the violent collapse of the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, and the Habsburgs in Austria, the British monarchy was acutely aware of its own vulnerability. To survive, George V orchestrated a massive rebranding of the royal family. They changed their name from the distinctly German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the deeply English Windsor. More important, lie. The king demanded absolute moral perfection from his children. They were no longer allowed to be aloof, untouchable aristocrats. They had to embody the ideal, dutiful, upper-middle-class British family. Any scandal involving illegal sexuality would not merely be an embarrassment. It was viewed as a direct, existential threat to the stability of the throne and the political order of the nation. Born on March 31st, 1900, Prince Henry was the third son of King George V and Queen Mary. Within the strict hierarchy of the royal household, he occupied a complex position. Unlike the charismatic heir, Edward, or the designated spare, Albert, Henry was the background prince, expected to serve the institution without ever eclipsing it. Consequently, he was pushed into a highly disciplined military career. He became the first child of a British monarch to be educated at school, attending St. Ronan's and Eton, rather than being sequestered with private tutors. He then proceeded to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He served in the 10th Royal Hussars, projecting the ultimate unassailable image of traditional British masculinity. He was a cavalry officer, a sportsman, a heavy drinker, and a loyal servant to the crown. He possessed a gruff exterior, a loud laugh, and a public persona that perfectly aligned with the expectations placed upon a royal duke. But military life and royal duty offered no genuine outlet for his true nature. Historical accounts, whispered establishment rumors, and the subsequent actions of the royal household reveal that Henry had no interest in the elite, refined, aristocratic circles of the underground gay scene. In London, there were discreet, highly exclusive gatherings where wealthy, titled men could meet in relative safety, protected by their shared status. Henry actively avoided these circles. Instead, he was drawn to what was contemporaneously known as rough trade. This was a dangerous, volatile crossing of class lines. Henry sought out working-class men, off-duty soldiers, and street hustlers. By venturing into the East End of London or the transient neighborhoods of foreign cities, Henry stepped entirely outside the protective, controlled bubble of his aristocratic life. The psychological motivations for this are complex. For a man whose entire existence was micromanaged, observed, and dictated by the rigid protocols of the royal court, the anonymity and raw reality of the streets may have offered a perverse kind of freedom. Furthermore, men of the lower classes were viewed by men of Henry's station as disposable, easily bought, and unlikely to be believed if they ever dared to speak against a prince of the realm. It was an assumption born of immense privilege, and it was a miscalculation that nearly brought the monarchy to its knees. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, lived out his days in absolute luxury, protected by the very institution that would have destroyed him had his secret been exposed. Following his brother George VI's unexpected ascension to the throne, and later the ascension of his niece Queen Elizabeth II, Henry continued his duties. He served as Governor-General of Australia, a post that required immense public visibility and respectability, further cementing his image as an imperial statesman. He attended state dinners, reviewed troops, and stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the very picture of establishment authority. As he aged, he suffered a series of debilitating strokes that eventually removed him from public life. He died quietly in 1974, at the age of 74, widely mourned by the establishment as a dedicated servant of the crown. There was no public reckoning during his lifetime. The blackmail letters were ashes. The Parisian extortionist was long gone, and the narrative of the dutiful, masculine soldier prince was successfully cemented into official royal history. The complete success of the cover-up demonstrates the terrifying efficiency of elite power. The story of Prince Henry is not merely a tale of personal transgression or a salacious footnote in royal history. It is a profound historical indictment of systemic inequality and the deeply entrenched hypocrisy of the British class system. It forces a confrontation with the brutal reality of how justice was, and often still is, selectively administered. Thousands of ordinary men in 20th century Britain had their lives, their careers, their mental health, and their families destroyed by the very laws that Prince Henry casually and repeatedly broke. They faced the cold stone of a prison cell and the unending shame of public exposure. When a commoner was caught, the full crushing weight of the state was brought down upon him. When a Windsor was caught, he was protected by a wall of cash, an impenetrable code of silence, and the ultimate privilege of his bloodline. The legacy of the Duke of Gloucester is not found in his military service or his royal tours, but in the glaring, uncomfortable truth that for the architects of society, the law is simply an inconvenience that can be bought, buried, and forgotten. The foundation of any great deception requires a perfectly constructed facade, and the House of Windsor were master architects of illusion. To comprehend how Prince Henry eventually found himself in a squalid Parisian hotel room, handing over the leverage to destroy the British monarchy, we must first examine the anvil upon which his identity was forged. His childhood was not a fairy tale of unbounded freedom. It was a psychological pressure cooker. He was raised in an environment where human emotion was treated as a severe liability and absolute obedience to the institution was the only currency of value. King George V, Henry's father, did not run a family. He commanded a garrison. Having spent his formative years in the Royal Navy, the king applied the exact same draconian discipline to his children that he would to a ship's crew. He famously and chillingly declared his father had been frightened of his mother, he was frightened of his father, and he would damn well see to it that his children were frightened of him. It was a promise he kept with brutal efficiency. The king's voice, a booming quarterdeck roar, terrified Henry. The boy developed a nervous, high-pitched laugh and a stammering hesitation, physical manifestations of the sheer anxiety that permeated his daily existence. Queen Mary, his mother, offered no sanctuary. She was a woman completely subsumed by the concept of majesty, emotionally detached and utterly subservient to her husband's volatile moods. She treated her children more like subjects than sons. The royal nursery at York Cottage, a notoriously cramped, gloomy residence on the Sandringham estate where the king insisted on living, was a place of severe emotional starvation. Affection was not given. It was earned through rigid compliance. In this environment, Henry learned his first and most defining lesson: survival meant hiding your true self. The institution did not care who you were inside. It only cared about what you projected to the outside world. Henry was not blessed with the natural, effortless charm of his eldest brother, Edward. He was not intellectually gifted, and he lacked the quiet, steady fortitude of his brother Albert. Henry was considered slow, somewhat lumbering, and entirely unremarkable. Within the ruthless hierarchy of the royal family, to be unremarkable is a dangerous thing. It means you must compensate with absolute, unyielding conformity. The royal machine quickly determined the role Henry was to play. He would not be the glamorous ambassador or the thoughtful intellectual. He was to be the soldier prince. In a departure from royal tradition, which previously saw princes educated in total isolation by private tutors, Henry was thrust into the brutal arena of the British public school system. He was sent to St. Ronan's and later to Eton. The intention was to toughen him up, to strip away any lingering royal softness and forge him into a standard British officer. The reality was a prolonged period of isolation and bullying. His title did not protect him. It made him a target. He was surrounded by the sons of the aristocracy, boys who quickly learned that while you could not strike a prince, you could isolate him, mock his slow intellect, and exploit his desperation for approval. He learned to build walls. He learned to adopt the gruff, unfeeling exterior expected of boys in his station. This period cemented his profound alienation from his own social class. The aristocratic circles, the drawing rooms, the high society gatherings, these were places where Henry felt judged, inadequate, and fundamentally unsafe. He grew to despise the refined, witty banter of the upper classes, recognizing it as the very language of his childhood tormentors. The royal blueprint then pushed him into the military. He entered the Royal Military College at Sandhurst and was subsequently commissioned into the 10th Royal Hussars. This was the defining era of the cavalry officer, a world defined by polo ponies, heavy drinking, fierce physical competition, and a toxic, hyper-masculine code of conduct. To the profound relief of King George V, Henry appeared to thrive. He looked the part perfectly. He was tall, heavily built, and possessed a loud, barking voice that echoed his father's. He threw himself into the military lifestyle, becoming a highly competent horseman and a dedicated regimental officer. The palace press office eagerly fed the public images of the Duke of Gloucester, in uniform, riding in formation, the absolute embodiment of traditional British virility and duty. But the uniform was a straitjacket. The military, while offering a structured escape from the immediate terror of his father, demanded an entirely different kind of conformity. In the officers' mess, under the constant scrutinizing gaze of his peers and commanding officers, Henry had to maintain a relentless performance of conventional heterosexuality. It was an era where the shadow of the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act hung heavy over British society. The downfall of Oscar Wilde was still a living memory, serving as a terrifying warning to the upper classes. The law made no distinction between public acts and private, consensual behavior behind closed doors. To be exposed as a homosexual was to face hard labor, public ruination, and permanent exile from polite society. For a member of the royal family, the stakes were unimaginably higher. There was no precedent for a royal prince being caught in such a scandal, and the assumption was that the monarchy itself might not survive the blow. Therefore, within the elite echelons of the gay underground in London, the discreet, highly guarded parties held in Mayfair townhouses, there was a strict code of silence. Men of wealth and title sought each other out, relying on mutually assured destruction to keep their secrets safe. Yet, Henry did not seek refuge in these aristocratic safe havens. The psychological scars of his upbringing dictated his desires. The upper-class men in those secret circles were the same kind of men who had mocked him at Eton, the same kind of men who populated his father's terrifying court. They were too close to the source of his trauma. Furthermore, interacting with men of his own class involved complex negotiations of power and status that Henry found exhausting. Instead, a profound and dangerous duality began to take root in his psyche. During the day, he was the Duke of Gloucester, the king's son, returning the salutes of the Empire's soldiers. But when the night fell, and the crushing weight of the Windsor expectation became too heavy to bear, he sought a release that was as explosive as it was self-destructive. He did not want equals. He wanted anonymity. He wanted men who did not know the rules of the court, men who were entirely disconnected from the glittering, suffocating world of Buckingham Palace. He began to look downward, across the rigid class lines of British society. He found himself drawn to the grooms who tended the horses, the enlisted soldiers who stood guard, the rough working-class men who populated the pubs and shadows of London's poorer districts. In the parlance of the era, he developed a ravenous appetite for rough trade. This was an incredibly dangerous game. By crossing class lines to satisfy his desires, Henry stripped away all the protections his title usually afforded him. When an aristocrat sleeps with another aristocrat, both have everything to lose by talking. When an aristocrat sleeps with a man from the slums, the power dynamic is entirely different. The working class man has nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain. The aristocracy viewed the lower classes as disposable and silent, assuming that a prince's word would always crush the accusations of a street hustler. It was an arrogance born of generations of unchecked privilege. Henry operated under this delusion of invincibility. He believed that if he stepped far enough outside his world, the rules of his world ceased to exist. He would dress in civilian clothes, pull his hat low, and slip out of the heavily guarded royal residences. He navigated the foggy streets of London, seeking brief, intense encounters in spaces where his royal lineage meant nothing and his cash meant everything. In these fleeting moments, stripped of his title and his duty, he found a twisted form of autonomy. He was no longer the slow, lumbering prince desperate for his father's approval. He was the man with the money, the man in control. The Windsor machine, entirely focused on public perception, was completely blind to the reality of what Henry was doing. They saw the military promotions, the polo matches, and the dutiful attendance at state banquets. They believed their brutal child-rearing tactics had successfully manufactured the perfect, compliant royal servant. They led to realize that by denying him any genuine emotional outlet, by crushing his authentic self under the immense weight of the crown, they had created a deeply fractured man. The tragedy of Prince Henry's early life is not just the trauma he endured, but the terrible mechanisms of coping he was forced to invent. He was a prisoner of his birthright, a man who built a magnificent, unbreachable fortress around himself, only to realize he had locked himself inside. The institution demanded perfection, and he gave them the illusion of it. But illusions require constant maintenance, and the psychological toll of living a fractured existence was driving him closer to the edge. The soldier prince was a masterpiece of royal propaganda, but the man beneath the uniform was a ticking time bomb, wandering blindly toward a catastrophe that would eventually detonate on the streets of Paris. Paris, in the years following the Great War, was a city of fractured realities. On the grand boulevards and in the opulent dining rooms of the Ritz, American expatriates and European aristocracy danced away the trauma of the trenches in a glittering, frantic display of wealth. But beneath this champagne-soaked surface lay a vast, shadowed underworld. The city was teeming with deserters, displaced workers, and desperate young men who had flocked to the capital, looking for survival by any means necessary. It was a city that understood vice, tolerated discretion, and above all, worshipped cold, hard currency. For Prince Henry, it offered an intoxicating illusion of complete invisibility. When he crossed the English Channel, he left behind the suffocating oversight of his father's court and the rigid expectations of the British press. In London, his face was a national symbol. In the dimly lit, smoke-filled cabarets of Montmartre and the transient hotels of the Marais, he was simply another wealthy foreigner with dark appetites and deep pockets. It was in this permissive, dangerous environment that Henry's carefully compartmentalized life began to unravel. The exact details of how he met the Parisian hustler who would nearly bring down the House of Windsor were never recorded in official police files, for reasons that would soon become aggressively apparent. But the pattern of his behavior was well established. He did not seek out the refined companions of the aristocratic gay salons. He sought out the rough edges of society. He looked for men whose silence could be bought, men who possessed a hardened street-level authenticity that contrasted sharply with the powdered, artificial world of Buckingham Palace. The man he found in Paris was exactly the type of rough trade the prince craved. He was not a romantic partner. He was a transaction. For a time, Henry operated under the arrogant assumption that this transaction was entirely on his terms. He believed that the power dynamic was firmly anchored by his vast wealth and the sheer unassailable weight of his class. In the confined space of a rented room, stripped of his military regalia and his royal title, Henry believed he was the master of the situation. He was the one dispensing the cash, and therefore he was the one in control. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Henry was blindingly naive to the predatory nature of the world he was playing in. He failed to understand that a man who sells himself on the streets of Paris has a survival instinct far sharper than any cavalry officer trained at Sandhurst. The street hustler was highly observant. While Henry believed he was operating incognito, his bearing, his accent, the quality of his tailored civilian clothes, and his seemingly bottomless supply of high-denomination banknotes signaled his extreme wealth. It did not take long for the Parisian to identify his client. Whether he recognized the prince from an international newspaper or simply pieced together the clues of his immense privilege, the hustler realized he had stumbled into a gold mine. He was no longer just servicing a wealthy tourist. He was sharing a bed with the son of the British king. However, knowing the identity of the prince was not enough. To exploit it, he needed leverage. He needed undeniable physical proof. This is where Prince Henry committed an act of staggering recklessness. In an era where written correspondence was the primary means of distance communication, people wrote letters with a frequency and passion rarely seen today. But for a man engaging in a criminalized sexual act, committing anything to paper was tantamount to signing a confession. Yet, Henry wrote, whether driven by a misplaced sense of romantic attachment, a foolish arrogance that his private correspondence was untouchable, or simply the intoxicating thrill of breaking the rules, the prince penned letters to the Parisian man. These were not vague, polite notes. The historical consensus, supported by the sheer panic they subsequently induced in the royal household, indicates that these letters were deeply compromising. They were explicit in their nature, detailing their encounters and establishing an undeniable record of a homosexual relationship. For Henry, the ink on that paper was a fatal lapse in judgment. For the hustler, it was the ultimate insurance policy. Once the Parisian had secured the letters, the entire power dynamic of their relationship inverted overnight. The transaction was no longer about sex. It was about extortion. The trap, baited by Henry's own desires and sealed by his own handwriting, snapped shut. The delivery of the blackmail demand was cold, calculated, and devastating. The hustler made his intentions clear. He possessed the letters. He knew exactly who Henry was, and he demanded a staggering sum of money. The threat attached to the demand was an existential strike against the British monarchy. If the financial demands were not met swiftly and completely, the letters would not be sent to the police. The police could be manipulated. Instead, the letters would be delivered directly to the international press. The psychological shock to Prince Henry must have been paralyzing. For his entire life, he had been shielded from consequence. If he fell off a horse, a team of doctors rushed to his aid. If he desired a specific commission in the military, it was arranged. He had lived in a world where reality was bent to accommodate his status. Now, sitting in a foreign city, staring at a demand from a man society deemed worthless, Henry faced total, absolute destruction. He could not go to the French authorities. To involve the Paris police would mean admitting to a severe criminal offense, risking arrest, and ensuring the scandal became a matter of public record. He certainly could not go to the British authorities. The Metropolitan Police in London were actively hunting down and locking up men for the exact behavior he had engaged in. If Scotland Yard were informed, the constitutional crisis would be instantaneous. He was a prince of the realm, entirely trapped by the very moral and legal codes his family had championed. The terrifying reality washed over him. He could not command his way out of this. He could not fight his way out of this. The letters existed. The threat was real. If those letters reached the tabloid editors in London or Paris, the headline would not just destroy his career. It would permanently shatter the image of the Windsor dynasty. The king would be humiliated on a global scale. The British public, suffering through economic hardship and holding the royal family as the ultimate standard of decency, would revolt, and Henry himself would face the very real prospect of a criminal trial and imprisonment. Isolated, terrified, and acutely aware that he had handed the weapon of his own destruction to a foreign criminal, the Duke of Gloucester realized he had only one option left. He had to bypass the law entirely. He had to reach out to the only entity powerful enough, wealthy enough, and motivated enough to operate in the shadows and make the nightmare disappear. He had to send a desperate plea back to London, bypassing his terrifying father, and throw himself on the mercy of the inner machinery of the royal family. The problem was no longer just Henry's. It was about to become the most dangerous secret in the British Empire. When the realization of his catastrophic vulnerability finally settled upon Prince Henry, the immediate question was not how to solve the problem, but who could solve it. To confess his predicament to his father, King George V, was physically impossible. The king's explosive temper was legendary, and his rigid moral worldview left no room for nuance, let alone an admission of criminal homosexuality and a blackmail plot involving a foreign prostitute. The king would have viewed Henry's actions not merely as a personal failing, but as treason against the Windsor brand. The shock might have literally killed the aging monarch, or more likely prompted him to banish his son to the furthest reaches of the empire in a fit of righteous fury. The royal household, structured entirely around the king's terrifying authority, was an impenetrable fortress of traditional values. There was no sympathy to be found there. Henry had to look elsewhere. He turned to the one person within the family who understood the mechanics of scandal, the necessity of secrets, and the modern realities of the world outside the palace walls. His eldest brother, Edward, the Prince of Wales. Edward, known to the family as David, was the polar opposite of Henry. He was charismatic, globally adored, and deeply enmeshed in the glamorous, often illicit social scenes of London, Paris, and New York. While Edward's own scandalous behavior involved highly publicized affairs with married women, a path that would eventually lead to his abdication for Wallis Simpson, he possessed a shrewd, pragmatic understanding of how the world actually worked. Edward recognized that the press was a beast that needed to be managed, and he understood that the rigid morality of their father was entirely unequipped to handle a modern extortion plot. When Henry, panicked and cornered, brought the disaster to his brother's attention, Edward did not respond with moral outrage. He responded with the cold, calculating efficiency of a man protecting his inheritance. Edward immediately grasped the existential threat the blackmail letters posed. It was not simply about saving Henry from a prison cell, it was about protecting the crown itself. The Prince of Wales recognized that they were dealing with a situation that required absolute deniability. They could not utilize the official apparatus of the British state, calling upon the Metropolitan Police or the nascent intelligence services would create official records, files, and a trail of whispers that would inevitably leak to the establishment and eventually the public. The moment a police inspector was briefed on the matter, the secret was no longer secure. Instead, Edward activated a shadow apparatus. Surrounding the upper echelons of the royal family has always been a network of highly discreet, fiercely loyal individuals, equerries, private secretaries, and aristocratic fixers who operate in the gray spaces between the law and the crown's interests. These were men who understood that their primary duty was not to the Constitution, but to the preservation of the royal dignity at any cost. Edward tasked this inner circle with a singular, unrecorded mission. Go to Paris, find the blackmailer, pay whatever sum he demanded, and retrieve the handwritten evidence. The logistics of such an operation required a terrifying level of unaccountable power. First, the hush money had to be assembled. The sum demanded by the Parisian hustler was astronomical, reflecting the immense value of the secret he held. This was not money that could be casually withdrawn from a standard bank account. It had to be untraceable. Whether the DS were drawn from the vast private revenues of the Duchy of Cornwall, which Edward controlled, or from deeply buried royal reserves, the reality remains that an immense fortune, essentially derived from the wealth of the nation, was mobilized for an illegal purpose. It was a massive financial transaction executed in total secrecy, designed specifically to subvert the course of justice. The emissaries chosen for this task crossed the English Channel not as representatives of the British government, but as well-dressed bagmen for the House of Windsor. The exact identities of these men remain shielded by decades of institutional silence, but their methodology is clear. They arrived in Paris, navigating the same shadowy underworld that Henry had so recklessly frequented. However, they did not arrive with the vulnerable desperation of a compromised prince. They arrived with the cold, intimidating authority of the British establishment. The meeting between the royal fixers and the Parisian extortionist is one of the most chilling, unrecorded moments in modern royal history. It would not have taken place in a grand embassy or a formal office, but in a discreet, neutral location. Perhaps a private room in a quiet hotel or a secluded office managed by trusted French intermediaries. The contrast in the room would have been stark. The polished, impeccably mannered representatives of the British crown, sitting across from a streetwise hustler who had successfully cornered an empire. There was no negotiation, no moralizing, and no threats of police intervention. The royal emissaries knew that any threat of legal action was empty. A trial was the exact outcome they were paying to avoid. The transaction was executed with a brutal, silent efficiency. The briefcase of untraceable currency was presented. The extortionist, having successfully called the bluff of the most powerful family on earth, handed over the letters. He counted his immense fortune, walking away completely untouched by the law, rewarded handsomely for his crime. Once the letters were secured, the emissaries did not risk transporting them back to London. A train derailment, a customs search, or a stolen bag could have revived the entire nightmare. The evidence had to be eradicated immediately. In the safety of a secure location, the handwritten letters, the undeniable proof of Prince Henry's crimes, the documentation of his vulnerability, and the weapon that had nearly destroyed the monarchy were put to the fire. They were burned to ash, leaving absolutely no physical trace that the transaction, the relationship, or the crime had ever occurred. When the word was securely relayed back to London that the mission was accomplished and the ashes were cold, the collective sigh of relief within Edward's inner circle must have been immense. The immediate crisis was averted. The press remained blind. The king remained completely ignorant, continuing to oversee his empire, oblivious to the fact that his regime had just survived a near-fatal blow entirely through the use of illicit hush money. Prince Henry had survived. He had faced the absolute edge of total destruction and had been pulled back by the sheer force of his family's wealth. but the salvation came at a profound psychological cost. He returned to his military duties and his royal appearances, projecting the same gruff, masculine exterior as before. He rode the horses, he wore the uniforms, and he saluted the crowds. But he knew, and the inner circle knew, exactly how fragile that facade was. He had been proven spectacularly reckless and wildly incompetent in managing his own double life. Furthermore, the moral implications of what had just occurred were staggering. Henry was forced to live with the knowledge that he was not immune to the consequences of his actions because he was innocent. He was immune simply because his family could afford to buy the law. As he walked the streets of London, he would pass police officers active, lie arresting working-class men for the same desires he harbored. He would read newspapers detailing the destruction of ordinary lives in the courts. He was a living embodiment of the most cynical truth of the British class system. The rules are meant to constrain the many, but they are entirely negotiable for the few. While the letters were gone and the French blackmailer was silenced, the problem of Prince Henry was far from solved. The crisis had fundamentally altered how he was viewed by the royal establishment. He was no longer just the slow, unremarkable younger brother. He was a documented liability. Edward and the men in the gray suits realized that Henry's appetites had not been extinguished. They had simply been suppressed by fear. A man who seeks out rough trade on the streets of Paris cannot be trusted to remain quietly in his barracks. The financial bailout was merely a tourniquet. To permanently secure the House of Windsor, they needed to fundamentally alter Henry's reality. They needed to place him in a cage so respectable, so publicly unassailable, that the underworld could never reach him again. The search for a permanent human shield was about to begin. The ashes of the Parisian blackmail letters had barely settled before the inner circle of the House of Windsor recognized a terrifying truth. A secret is only safe until the next time it is exposed. Prince Henry had been rescued from the absolute brink of criminal ruin, but his fundamental nature had not changed. The appetites that had driven him from the heavily guarded gates of Buckingham Palace to the transient, dangerous hotels of the French underworld were still there, simmering beneath his military uniform. His brother Edward, the Prince of Wales, and the cadre of royal fixers who had executed the payoff understood that they could not spend the rest of their lives dispatching men with briefcases of cash to clean up Henry's reckless encounters. The financial cost was immense, but the political risk was apocalyptic. A temporary bailout was insufficient. They required a permanent structural solution to contain the Duke of Gloucester. They needed to build him a cage so respectable, so thoroughly wrapped in the flag and the altar, that no one would ever dare question what lay inside. The machinery of the British establishment immediately turned to its most reliable and ancient instrument of control, matrimony. In the high aristocratic circles of the 1930s, marriage was rarely a matter of romantic destiny. It was an exercise in statecraft, property consolidation, and, quite frequently, reputation management. For Henry, a royal duke whose bachelorhood was now a documented critical liability, finding a wife was no longer an expectation. It was a mandate of national security. But the selection of the bride required a delicate, almost surgical precision. The woman chosen to be the Duchess of Gloucester could not be a glittering, worldly socialite from the Mayfair set. Such a woman would ask too many questions, demand too much attention, and possess the social fluency to realize exactly what her husband was doing when he slipped out into the night. Conversely, she could not be a naive, fragile debutante who would shatter at the first realization that her fairy tale royal marriage was a hollow, physical sham. The Windsor strategists needed a very specific archetype. They needed a woman of impeccable, unassailable aristocratic breeding, a woman to whom the concept of duty was a religious calling. She had to be stoic, comfortable with emotional distance, and intimately familiar with the unspoken rules of the British upper classes, where appearances were maintained at the cost of personal happiness. She needed to be a woman who could manage large estates, breed hunting dogs, smile for the cameras, and never ever look too closely at the private shadows of her husband's life. They found the perfect candidate in Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott. To understand the profile and tragedy of the life that awaited Lady Alice, one must understand the world that forged her. She was the third daughter of the 7th Duke of Gloucester, one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and largest landowners in the entirety of Scotland. She was raised in vast, drafty castles, surrounded by thousands of acres of moorland. Her upbringing was characterized by cold nurseries, emotionally distant parents, and a rigorous adherence to outdoor pursuits. Lady Alice was not a creature of the city. She was a woman of the country, deeply comfortable in tweed, surrounded by horses and spaniels, accustomed to the freezing Scottish winds and the silent, unspoken expectations of her immense privilege. By the time the royal gaze fell upon her, Lady Alice was in her early 30s. In the brutal mathematics of the 1930s, aristocratic marriage market, she was considered entirely past her prime, teetering on the edge of permanent spinsterhood. While she had traveled extensively, spending time in Kenya and India demonstrating an independent, adventurous streak, she remained unmarried, quietly returning to the Scottish estates to manage her father's households. She was practical, sensible, and completely devoid of the dramatic vanity that characterized the younger, wealthier women of her set. It is highly likely that Lady Alice understood exactly what she was being chosen for, even if the sordid criminal details of the Parisian blackmail plot were kept strictly hidden from her. In the enclosed, whispering world of the British aristocracy, the concept of a lavender marriage, a union designed to conceal the homosexuality of a high-status man, was an understood, if never openly discussed, reality. Women of Alice's class were frequently sacrificed on the altar of family reputation, tasked with providing heirs and an unimpeachable social front for men whose true desires lay elsewhere. When the Duke of Gloucester, a man she had known in passing for years but had never shared a shred of romantic intimacy with, suddenly began making concerted, highly orchestrated visits to her family's estates, the writing was on the wall. The courtship was a masterpiece of cold, mechanical efficiency. There were no swept-away romances, no passionate declarations of love. Henry pursued Alice because he had been ordered to do so by his family, and Alice accepted his attentions because to refuse a royal duke, to refuse the son of the king, was practically unthinkable for a daughter of a loyal Scottish duke. Furthermore, marrying Henry offered her a definitive purpose. It elevated her from the role of a useful unmarried daughter to a central figure in the British Empire. She would become a royal highness. She would be given a task, a role, a duty to perform on the world stage. For a woman raised to believe that duty was the highest human calling, the proposition was an offer she could not refuse, regardless of the personal cost. In August 1935, the engagement was officially announced to a rapturous British public. The palace press machinery immediately shifted into high gear, desperate to project a narrative of traditional, robust, royal romance. King George V, whose health was rapidly failing and whose empire was facing the dark, looming clouds of fascism in Europe, seized upon the wedding as a vital opportunity to project stability and continuity. The press hailed Lady Alice as the perfect Scottish bride, a woman of the soil, bringing a fresh, healthy vigor to the House of Windsor. The narrative was meticulously crafted, completely burying the fact that the groom was a deeply traumatized, closeted man who had recently been extorted by a Parisian street hustler. The wedding itself, initially planned as a grand spectacle at Westminster Abbey, had to be scaled back to a private chapel at Buckingham Palace due to the sudden death of Alice's father just weeks before the ceremony. Yet even in its reduced scale, it was a profound exercise in institutional power. On November 6, 1935, Lady Alice walked down the aisle, wrapped in a severe, stunning dress of pearl pink satin, her face shielded by a heavy veil. As she stood beside the broad, uniformed figure of Prince Henry, reciting vows of lifelong fidelity and devotion, she was stepping into a gilded lifelong prison. The cheering crowds outside the palace gates, waving Union Jacks and celebrating the royal union, had absolutely no idea what they were witnessing. They saw a prince claiming his princess. They did not see the invisible chains. They did not see that the entire grand spectacle was a brilliantly executed cover-up, a state-sponsored defense mechanism designed to permanently neutralize the threat of Henry's sexuality. Lady Alice was not just a bride, she was a human shield. Her presence, her respectability, and her womb were the final payment required to seal the vault on Henry's past. The immediate reality of their domestic life was chilling. Following the wedding, the newly minted Duke and Duchess of Gloucester established their household. They were given Barnwell Manor, a sprawling, isolated estate in Northamptonshire, far from the prying eyes of the London press, and crucially, far from the dark, anonymous streets that Henry had once prowled. The estate became the physical manifestation of the cage his family had built for him. Behind the heavy oak doors of Barnwell, the true nature of the Windsor arrangement played out in suffocating silence. There was no honeymoon period, no sudden blossoming of unexpected love. Henry, having successfully secured his alibi, retreated heavily into himself, denied the only sexual and emotional outlets that felt authentic to him, and terrified of repeating the disaster in Paris, he completely shut down. The profound alienation he had felt his entire life metastasized into a deep functional depression. He managed this depression through rigid military routine and staggering amounts of alcohol. He would spend hours riding across the estate, exhausting himself physically, before returning to the manor to drink heavily in his study. The loud, barking laugh he used in public vanished at home, replaced by long, brooding silences and sudden, unpredictable flashes of temper. He treated Alice not with cruelty, but with an agonizing, polite indifference. She was a fixture in his house, a necessary component of his public survival, but she was not a partner. For Lady Alice, the isolation was absolute. She was a highly intelligent, practical woman trapped in a house with a ghost of a husband. She could not complain to her family. To admit failure in a royal marriage was impossible. She certainly could not complain to the king or queen, who viewed her entirely as a successful problem solved. She was forced to swallow her loneliness and pour her formidable energies into the management of the estate and the fulfillment of her royal duties. The most brutal aspect of the arrangement was the biological imperative. The marriage had been contracted to normalize Henry, and normalization required children. The production of heirs was the ultimate proof of a successful royal union. The physical intimacy required to achieve this was, by all historical indications, and the fundamental nature of Henry's true desires, a cold, mechanical duty performed entirely out of obligation to the crown. It was a transaction stripped of affection, executed solely to satisfy the public narrative and secure the Gloucester lineage. When Lady Alice finally gave birth to their two sons, Prince William in 1941 and Prince Richard in 1944, the palace breathed a collective final sigh of relief. The illusion was now complete. The Duke of Gloucester was a husband and a father. The narrative of the soldier prince had been perfectly restored. The trap had sprung, the lock had clicked, and the key was thrown away. Henry would never again roam the streets seeking the rough trade that had so nearly destroyed him. He was a prisoner of his own success, trapped him, and a flawlessly respectable life that brought him absolutely no joy. He would stand on the balconies, review the troops, and shake hands across the empire, projecting the ultimate image of British masculinity. But every night, he returned to the cold, silent halls of Barnwell Manor, sitting across the dining table from a woman he did not love, drinking away the memory of the life he was born to live, but strictly forbidden to have. The cover-up was an absolute, unmitigated triumph for the British monarchy. But for the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, it was a life sentence. The iron doors of Barnwell Manor had barely swung shut on Prince Henry's newly manufactured life when the foundation of the House of Windsor violently cracked beneath his feet. He had accepted the lavender marriage, retreated to the countryside, and allowed his family to bury his Parisian extortion scandal under layers of domestic propaganda. He believed he had purchased a quiet, heavily fortified obscurity. But the British monarchy is a ruthless machine, and in 1936 it demanded that the Duke of Gloucester step out of the shadows and directly into the blinding, unforgiving light of a constitutional crisis. The architect of this crisis was the very man who had saved Henry from total destruction, his eldest brother, Edward. The death of their terrifying father, King George V, in January 1936, triggered a seismic shift in the royal dynamic. Edward ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that the modernizing, glamorous brother who understood the dark realities of the world would usher in a new era. But Edward possessed a fatal flaw that Henry did not. Edward believed he could negotiate with the institution. He believed he could be the King of England and marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American commoner. The hypocrisy of what unfolded next is one of the most glaring indictments of the British establishment. Just years prior, the men in the gray suits, the private secretaries, the aristocratic fixers, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Prime Minister had quietly facilitated a massive, illegal payoff to a French male prostitute to cover up Prince Henry's homosexual crimes. They had subverted the law and lied to the public to protect the crown. Yet when King Edward formally declared his intention to marry a woman he genuinely loved, the very same establishment revolted. They drew a hard, impenetrable line. They had forgiven Henry's felonies because they were kept hidden, but they would not forgive Edward's breach of convention because it was public. The system could tolerate a criminal prince, provided he remained in the closet and married the right aristocratic woman. It could not tolerate a king who openly defied the rigid social and religious codes of the era. As the abdication crisis spiraled out of control in the freezing winter of 1936, Henry watched in silent horror. The brother who had dispatched the briefcases of cash to Paris, the brother who held the ultimate secret of Henry's life, was being systematically dismantled by the state. When Edward formally signed the instrument of abdication, surrendering the throne and going into permanent exile, the shockwaves hit Henry with physical force. His protector was gone. The buffer between Henry and the terrifying weight of the crown had vanished. The throne fell to their stammering, deeply anxious brother Albert, who took the name King George VI. Suddenly, the entire hierarchy of the family was upended. George VI was fragile, prone to nervous exhaustion, and completely unprepared for the burden of kingship. His heir, Princess Elizabeth, was merely a child. In this sudden, terrifying vacuum, the royal establishment turned their desperate gaze upon Henry. He was no longer the background prince. He was suddenly the senior royal duke, the king's primary supporting act, and, terrifyingly, the potential regent of the British Empire. If the fragile King George VI the Hubby, heir to die before Princess Elizabeth reached the age of 18, Henry, by law, would assume the regency. The man who had sought out rough trade in the slums of London, the man who had been extorted in a Parisian hotel, was now standing one heartbeat away from the absolute center of global power. The psychological toll of this sudden elevation was devastating. Henry was forced out of his rural isolation and thrust into a relentless schedule of public duties. He had to be everywhere his brother could not be. He was required to deliver speeches, a task he loathed and performed poorly, his voice often booming and monotonous, betraying his deep internal anxiety. He had to inspect fleets, cut ribbons, and project an image of absolute, unshakable Windsor solidity. To survive this crushing new reality, Henry relied heavily on the two things that never asked questions: military routine and alcohol. He drank with a steady, punishing rhythm. It was not the joyful social drinking of his youth, but the dark, medicinal drinking of a man trying to numb a constant, low-level panic. His temper, always volatile, became increasingly unpredictable behind closed doors. The booming laugh of the Duke of Gloucester was heard often in public, but the staff at his residences knew to tread carefully when the doors were shut and the decanters were opened. Through this agonizing transition, Lady Alice emerged not merely as a wife, but as the absolute bedrock of his survival. The Duchess of Gloucester proved to be an operator of terrifying competence. She recognized the fragility of her husband and the immense stakes of their position. If Henry collapsed under the pressure, the entire facade would shatter, and the dark secrets of his past might be exposed to a public that was already reeling from the abdication. Alice took control of the Gloucester machine. She managed his schedules, smoothed over his diplomatic blunders, and provided the calm, aristocratic smile that the cameras demanded. She was the ultimate company woman. When Henry was too drunk or too deeply sunk in his depressions to function, Alice stepped into the breach. She did not do this out of a burning, passionate love for the man. Their arrangement remained cold and fundamentally dutiful, but out of a ferocious loyalty to the institution and a desperate need to protect the future of her two young sons. She had signed a contract with the House of Windsor, and she intended to fulfill it, no matter how heavy the burden became. The true test of their fabricated reality arrived with the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. As the bombs began to fall on London and the British Empire faced an existential threat from Nazi Germany, the royal family was mobilized as the ultimate weapon of public morale. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth remained at Buckingham Palace, becoming symbols of national defiance. Henry, returning to his military roots, was appointed chief liaison officer to the British Expeditionary Force. For Henry, the war offered a bizarre kind of sanctuary. War was black and white. It was a theater of duty where orders were given and followed. He spent months in France inspecting troops, visiting trenches, and doing exactly what he had been trained to do since childhood. In a uniform, surrounded by the machinery of war, the complex, terrifying demons of his sexuality and his past were temporarily drowned out by the roar of artillery. However, the war also carried a unique, terrifying risk for a man with Henry's history. The intelligence services of the era were highly sophisticated and utterly ruthless. The Nazi regime, particularly the Gestapo, actively hunted for blackmail material on high-ranking Allied figures. Homosexuality, deemed a capital offense by the Third Reich, was the ultimate leverage. The fear that German intelligence might have intercepted communications, or that the Parisian blackmailer might have kept copies of the letters and sold them to the highest bidder, as a shadow that must have haunted the inner circles of the British establishment. Whether Henry consciously harbored this fear, or whether it simply added to the general, crushing anxiety of his existence is impossible to know for certain. But the response of the royal machinery was to keep him constantly moving, constantly visible in highly controlled environments. He was paraded across the empire, a symbol of royal commitment to the war effort. Lady Alice, too, threw herself into the war, working tirelessly with the Red Cross and the Order of St. John. They were the perfect, dutiful wartime couple. The public adored them. The propaganda machine had worked flawlessly. No one looking at the stern Duke and his tireless Duchess could possibly imagine the sordid, desperate history that bound them together. The culmination of this relentless duty came in 1945 as the war ground to a close. The British government, needing a figure of immense prestige to solidify imperial loyalty in the Pacific theater, appointed the Duke of Gloucester as the Governor-General of Australia. It was an assignment of staggering responsibility. Australia was a vast, complex nation emerging from the trauma of the war, and Henry was to be the direct representative of the king. It was also perhaps a strategic exile. By sending Henry to the other side of the world, the establishment removed him from the immediate pressures of London and the lingering, dangerous temptations of Europe. They packed him onto a ship with his wife, his children, and a massive staff, effectively transporting the Barnwell Manor cage to the southern hemisphere. The 2 years Henry spent in Australia were a study in agonizing endurance. He was a man deeply unsuited for the delicate, nuanced requirements of modern diplomacy. He hated the endless banquets, the political maneuvering, and the constant, inescapable scrutiny of the Australian press. The heat aggravated him, the schedule exhausted him, and his reliance on alcohol deepened significantly. Stories began to leak out of Government House, whispers of the Duke's explosive tantrums, his slurred speeches, and his profound visible misery. Once again, Lady Alice carried the weight of the crown. She traveled thousands of miles across the harsh Australian outback, charming local politicians, visiting hospitals, and projecting an aura of stoic British grace. She was the diplomat. Henry was merely the figurehead. The Australian public, largely unaware of the desperate internal dynamics of the marriage, respected the Duke's military record, but warmly embraced the Duchess. She was the glue holding the entire fragile operation together. When the Gloucesters finally returned to England in 1947, Henry was a diminished man. The relentless performance had ground him down. He had played the role of the soldier prince, the dutiful husband, the wartime leader, and the imperial statesman perfectly. He had fulfilled every single obligation placed upon him by the family that had bought his freedom. He had earned his immunity, but the victory was entirely hollow. He returned to a country that was rapidly changing, a post-war Britain that was beginning to dismantle the rigid class structures that had both imprisoned and protected him. He returned to a brother whose health was failing, and to a niece, Elizabeth, who was preparing to take the throne. The House of Windsor had survived the Abdication, the war, and the shifting tides of the 20th century. But as Prince Henry walked back through the heavy doors of Barnwell Manor, his youth gone, his true desires permanently locked away, and his legacy secured by a magnificent state-sponsored lie, the true cost of that survival was painfully clear. The return to England in 1947 offered no liberation for the Duke of Gloucester. Instead, it delivered him into a profoundly altered landscape. The Britain that Prince Henry had left behind was the battered but triumphant center of a global empire. The Britain I returned to was a gray, exhausted nation crippled by war debt, paralyzed by a freezing winter, and governed by strict rationing that applied, at least in theory, to everyone, from the factory worker to the king. The old imperial certainties were crumbling. India was declaring independence, the Labour government was dismantling the old class privileges, and the rigid, deferential society that had birthed and protected Henry was slowly breaking apart. But inside the thick stone walls of Barnwell Manor and the heavily guarded corridors of Buckingham Palace, the House of Windsor was desperately attempting to freeze time. Henry was a man who belonged entirely to a bygone era. He was a relic of the Edwardian cavalry, a man who measured worth in military protocol, medals, and hunting logs. The new post-war reality, with its emerging welfare state and atomic anxieties, bewildered him. More importantly, his role within the royal family was rapidly diminishing. He was no longer the vital central figure he had been during the Abdication or the terrifying early days of the Blitz. King George VI, though physically failing, had cemented his legacy as a victorious wartime monarch. The nation's eyes were now firmly fixed on the future, embodied by the king's radiant young heir, Princess Elizabeth, and her dynamic, modern new husband, Philip Mountbatten. Philip represented everything Henry was not. Philip was sharp, modern, intellectually curious, and brutally pragmatic. He drove fast cars, flew airplanes, and possessed a ruthless energy that made the older generation of royal dukes look painfully obsolete. Beside this new, glamorous royal patriarch, Henry appeared slow, lumbering, and deeply irrelevant. The public still respected him for his past service, but he was increasingly viewed as a ceremonial antique, wheeled out for state funerals, regiment inspections, and the unveiling of war memorials. He was becoming a ghost in his own lifetime. This growing irrelevance, coupled with the permanent suppression of his true identity, accelerated Henry's internal decay. The coping mechanisms he had relied upon for decades began to exact a visible physical toll. The heavy medicinal drinking that had sustained him through the anxieties of the 1930s and the crushing duties of the 1940s hardened into entrenched alcoholism. His face grew florid and heavy, his booming voice often slurred, and his once imposing physical presence gave way to an unsteady, deteriorating shuffle. The consequences of this deterioration were not kept entirely behind closed doors, but the royal cover-up machine, perfected during the Parisian blackmail crisis, simply adapted to handle a new set of liabilities. In his later years, Henry developed a terrifying habit of driving his cars, particularly his beloved Rolls-Royces, with reckless drunken abandon. He was involved in multiple severe car crashes. On several occasions, he drove his vehicle off the road, into ditches, or collided with other cars. For any ordinary citizen of post-war Britain, a string of highly destructive drunk driving incidents would have resulted in immediate arrest, the loss of their license, and public disgrace. But Henry was the king's brother. When local police constables arrived at the scenes of these accidents and recognized the flushed, disoriented Duke behind the wheel, the unwritten laws of the British establishment immediately engaged. The incidents were quietly sanitized. The palace fixers intervened. The police reports were heavily edited or buried, and the press was steered away. There were no breathalyzer tests for a Royal Highness, no humiliating court appearances, and no consequences. It was a chilling echo of the 1920s. Once again, Henry was vividly demonstrating that his bloodline granted him absolute immunity from the laws that governed the rest of the nation. He was insulated from reality, trapped in a bubble of privilege so complete that it was slowly killing him. The most agonizing psychological blow of this era, however, did not come from his physical decline, but from a profound shift in the legal and social fabric of the country itself. In the early 1950s, the British establishment cracked down on homosexuality with renewed vicious intensity. High-profile figures, most notably the brilliant mathematician Alan Turing, whose code-breaking genius had helped win the war, were arrested, prosecuted, and subjected to barbaric chemical castration simply for being gay. The hypocrisy was staggering. As Turing was driven to suicide by the state, Prince Henry sat in his sprawling country estate, his own history of illegal homosexual encounters scrubbed from existence by the very same government. But then, the ice began to crack. In 1957, the British government published the Wolf and Den Report. Following a series of highly embarrassing public scandals that proved the existing laws were unworkable and cruel, a committee concluded that homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private should no longer be a criminal offense. It was a revolutionary document, the first major step toward dismantling the Victorian legal framework that had terrorized gay men for a century. One can only imagine the profound, bitter irony Prince Henry must have felt reading the headlines of the Wolf and Den Report in the hushed quiet of his drawing room. The society outside his gates was finally beginning to debate the morality of the laws that had forced him into a lifetime of hiding. The country was slowly, agonizingly dragging itself toward a future where a man might not have to face a prison cell or an extortionist simply for his sexual orientation. But this shifting tide offered absolutely no salvation for the Duke of Gloucester. He was born 3 decades too early, and his trap had been sprung long before the world decided to change. He could never benefit from the softening of the laws. He could never step out of the lavender marriage. He was permanently locked into the narrative that the House of Windsor had purchased for him in Paris. If he were to reveal the truth now, it would not be viewed as a brave step toward liberation. It would expose the monarchy's complicity in a massive historic cover-up. It would prove that the crown had used its vast wealth and power to subvert the justice system. The institution had protected him, but the price of that protection was that he must die with the lie intact. He was a prisoner of his own alibi. As Henry retreated further into the foggy isolation of his declining health, the stark contrast of his unlived life was thrown into sharp relief by the emergence of his eldest son, Prince William of Gloucester. Born in 1941, William was everything his father had never been permitted to be. He was breathtakingly handsome, intellectually brilliant, and fiercely independent. While Henry had been crushed into the mold of the obedient traditional soldier, William actively rejected the suffocating constraints of royal life. He attended Cambridge and Stanford, traveled the globe, and embarked on a career in the diplomatic service, working in Lagos and Tokyo. William navigated the world with an effortless modern grace that deeply unsettled the older generation of royals. He flew his own airplanes, dated a glamorous former model, and openly questioned the relevance of the institution that had consumed his father. For Henry, watching William must have been a complex agony. On one hand, there was undeniable pride in his golden son. On the other, William was a walking, breathing manifestation of the freedom Henry had been violently denied. William was living the authentic, untethered life that Henry had only ever glimpsed in the dangerous, anonymous shadows of the Parisian underworld. The relationship between the heavy, silent, tradition-bound father and the dynamic, liberal son was marked by a vast, unbridgeable gulf. William loved his parents, but he viewed the atmosphere of Barnwell Manor as profoundly melancholic. He saw the coldness of the marriage and the quiet desperation of his father's existence, and he ran as far from it as the world would allow. William understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that being a prince of the Windsor blood was not a privilege, but a gilded trap. He was determined not to end up like the Duke of Gloucester, a man who had survived his life rather than lived it. By the late 1960s, the world had entirely moved on. The cultural revolution of the decade had transformed London into a vibrant, permissive epicenter of youth and rebellion. The strict social codes that had dictated Henry's youth were being dismantled in the streets. Yet, the Duke of Gloucester remained perfectly preserved in amber. In 1965, he suffered a severe car accident, overturning his vehicle in a terrifying crash that left him badly injured. The palace, as always, managed the fallout, but the physical damage was permanent. This accident marked the beginning of a rapid, brutal physical decline. A series of debilitating strokes began to strip away the remaining faculties of the once imposing soldier prince. He lost his mobility, his booming voice was reduced to an incomprehensible whisper, and he was eventually confined entirely to a wheelchair. The man who had ridden with the 10th Royal Hussars and commanded the attention of the Empire was now a silent, immobile figure, wheeled through the gardens of his Northamptonshire estate by nurses, Lady Alice fulfilling the final, most grueling clauses of her invisible contract, became his full-time caretaker. She managed his decline with the same unsentimental, iron-willed duty she had applied to their entire marriage. She protected him from the press, ensuring that the public never saw the full extent of his deterioration. She maintained the absolute dignity of the Gloucester household, standing as a fierce, unyielding sentinel at the gates of his final years. Trapped in a failing body, unable to communicate, Henry was left entirely with his memories. He was a man who had stood at the very apex of global privilege, a man who possessed wealth, titles, and immunity beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. Yet, as the final curtain began to fall, the utter tragedy of the Windsor bargain was inescapable. He had traded his authenticity for survival. He had allowed the institution to buy his freedom from a Parisian blackmailer, but in doing so, he had mortgaged his soul to the crown. He had spent 50 years playing a character written by a committee of royal fixers. The cover-up had succeeded flawlessly. The public believed the lie. The monarchy was safe. But the man who had lived it was slowly suffocating under the immense, crushing weight of a secret he could never, ever tell. The cruelest acts of fate are rarely those that strike suddenly. They are the ones that unfold with a slow, agonizing inevitability. For Prince Henry, trapped in the physical prison of his failing body and the psychological prison of Barnwell Manor, the final devastating blow did not come from the revelation of his past. The Windsor establishment had successfully buried the Parisian blackmail letters beneath decades of state-sponsored propaganda. His secret was safe. The blow, when it finally arrived, came from the one source of genuine, unscripted vitality left in his heavily orchestrated life, his eldest son, Prince William. William had become the living antithesis of everything the Duke of Gloucester represented. Where Henry had surrendered his authenticity to the demands of the crown, accepting a lavender marriage and a lifetime of suppressed desires, William actively defied the royal machine. He had refused to be molded into a silent, dutiful extra in the Windsor pageant. He lived dangerously and openly, taking civilian jobs, conducting high-profile romances outside the aristocratic pool, and channeling his restless energy into a fierce passion for aviation. William flew his own aircraft across the globe, treating the sky as the only territory where the suffocating rules of Buckingham Palace could not reach him. He was the golden boy of his generation, the charismatic modern prince that Henry had never been permitted to be. But freedom, particularly for a member of the British royal family, often carries a brutal price. On August 28, 1972, that price was extracted in front of 30,000 spectators. William was competing in the Goodyear International Air Trophy at Halfpenny Green, flying his Piper Cherokee Arrow. Shortly after takeoff at a very low altitude, the aircraft banked sharply, clipped a tree, and smashed violently into the ground. It immediately burst into an uncontrollable fireball. The 30-year-old prince and his co-pilot were killed instantly. Their bodies burned beyond recognition. The golden son, the heir to the Gloucester title, the man who had outrun the royal cage, was dead in a field in Staffordshire. The news of the fiery crash hit the British establishment like a physical shockwave. But nowhere was the devastation more profound than inside the silent, heavily guarded walls of Barnwell Manor. Lady Alice, the stoic duchess, who had spent her entire adult life managing crises, maintaining facades, and protecting her husband's fragile reality, was suddenly confronted with a grief that could not be managed. She had sacrificed her own capacity for a genuine romantic marriage to protect the Gloucester line, and in a single afternoon, the primary heir to that line had been incinerated. Yet, even in the face of absolute tragedy, the Windsor Protocol of Silence dictated the final act of this family's drama. By the late summer of 1972, Prince Henry was profoundly incapacitated. The series of severe strokes had stripped him of his mobility and his speech. He spent his days in a wheelchair, staring out at the expansive gardens of the estate, his mind trapped in a foggy twilight state. He was alive, but he was entirely disconnected from the reality of the world moving around him. Faced with the destruction of her son, Lady Alice made a decision that perfectly encapsulated the terrifying protective isolation of her marriage. She chose not to tell her husband that William was dead. She consulted with doctors and determined that the shock would either kill the Duke or subject him to an agony he lacked the cognitive ability to process. And so the ultimate secret was kept. For nearly 2 years following the plane crash, the household staff at Barnwell Manor operated under strict orders. There was to be no mention of William, no black armbands worn in Henry's presence, and no mourning projected in his line of sight. The psychological horror of this final deception is difficult to fully comprehend. The marriage that had begun with a state-mandated cover-up in 1935, designed to hide Henry's illicit desires and the Parisian extortion plot, ended with a domestic cover-up in 1974. Henry sat in his wheelchair day after day, occasionally managing a garbled inquiry about where his eldest son was, or when William might be coming to visit. Alice, the ultimate sentinel, would calmly invent a lie. She would tell him William was away on diplomatic business, or flying abroad, or simply busy in London. Henry would accept the lie and return to his silence. He was a man who had survived a blackmail plot that threatened the monarchy, only to die without knowing his own bloodline had been irreparably shattered. On June 10, 1974, Prince Henry, the Duke of Gloucester, died quietly at Barnwell Manor at the age of 74. His death was not a sudden tragedy, but the slow, final expiration of a man who had outlived his era. The immediate machinery of the British state ground into motion, executing the precise, highly polished rituals reserved for a senior member of the royal family. There was no public reckoning. There was no mention of the wild, dangerous nights in the 1920s, the rough trade, or the desperate, secret dispatch of royal fixers. Oh, France with briefcases of untraceable cash. The establishment media published sweeping, respectful obituaries that focused entirely on his military record, his tenure as Governor-General of Australia, and his steadfast loyalty to his brothers and his niece, Queen Elizabeth II. His funeral at St. George's Chapel in Windsor was a masterpiece of institutional continuity. The Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the extended royal family gathered to honor the last surviving child of King George V. His coffin was draped in his standard, topped with his military cap and sword. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered words of solemn praise. As the coffin was lowered into the royal vault, the cover-up achieved its ultimate permanent victory. The Parisian blackmailer was long gone. The handwritten letters were ashes. The Duke was buried a hero. The lie was sealed in marble. It would take decades for the true narrative to emerge. Only through the slow unlocking of archival material, private letters, and the relentless work of modern historians did the polished veneer of the soldier prince begin to crack. The truth, when it surfaced, did not diminish the history of the House of Windsor. Rather, it exposed the ruthless, terrifying efficiency of its survival mechanisms. While ordinary British men faced cold prison cells and public ruin for their desires, Henry's bloodline bought him absolute immunity. The establishment spared him from the law, yet condemned him to a lifelong psychological solitary confinement. They built him a magnificent cage, draped him in military honors, and forced him to play a soldier prince until the role broke him. The Parisian extortionist walked away with a fortune, but it was the British crown that extracted the ultimate ransom, demanding a man completely erase his true self to keep the royal illusion alive.